This is Office Hours,
the show for sharing experiences and stories in governance, risk management, and compliance. We're back for episode 11 of Office Hours, and despite my better judgment, Phil is back with us again. Hi, Phil.
Morning.
You must have gotten a couple likes.
I did. I got a couple likes.
I can't believe we're doing this again. Today, Phil, you proved in the last time you were here to be quite the data expert. How much of an IT risk and vulnerability expert are you?
4 out of 10.
4 out of 10. That's a very honest rating.
Mm-hmm.
I was just working with a customer, and I see this all the time, where what happens is a company begins to grow up. And of course, it's at a much earlier stage in a company's evolution where they tend to recognize the need for full-time IT security roles and an IT security team. And that team looks after hardcore security stuff, vulnerability scanning, threat management, all this sort of thing. It tends to be a couple of stages of evolution and maturity later where then they start to think about, actually, we'd like to have a more holistic picture of IT risk. Because it starts with security, right? Then it comes along and there's all these compliance requirements that get laid on them. SOC 2, PCI, whatever it is as they grow up, could become a compliance target. And then the board starts asking questions. What's our overall risk profile?
Right.
And that's what I want to talk about today is as you begin to make that journey through putting together a full picture of IT risk and compliance, I think one of the challenges, at least the challenge this company ran into and one I see all the time, is how do we translate our hardcore security work, as it were, into risk. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. You have all these vulnerabilities out there, and if you detect them all, that's great. But if you don't address the one high one, but you address 99% of the low ones, it's that high one that's going to get you.
Right. So if I'm a business executive, it's like, you know what? The security people are telling me all the time, I've got vulnerabilities everywhere. But what the hell does that actually mean to our risk profile? And so anybody who's watched previous episodes of Office Hours knows my whole shtick is robotimating. What word would you use for that? Automating. Yeah, very thoughtful of you.
Yeah.
Automating an ongoing real-time sort of translation of what does data say about our risk profile. And to me, vulnerabilities are largely just data, and we can accomplish the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
My co-host likes to ask very thorough and meaningful questions.
Yes.
So right off the bat, this particular client works a lot with Nessus. And of course, most organizations, I think, are doing, Nessus has been around a long, long time. Everybody uses it for vulnerability scanning. So what we did is looked at how could we build some scripts in ACL Analytics that would extract and consolidate all of the findings across all of my different Nessus scans. Mm-hmm. Pretty easy to do, right? Similarly, the other thing that this particular organization does, as many do, is watches the CVE database for new vulnerabilities disclosed and added to the CVE database. So import those. In this case, the CVE database in particular, it's free and offers a whole bunch of different formats in which you can download it from. So there's really no excuse not to be using it.
So when you're connecting the CVE database with your Nessus, are they connected easily?
Well, so Nessus when Nessus identifies vulnerabilities, if it is related to a CVE vulnerability, Nessus includes that in the data. So it's not so much that we're trying to join those. What we're trying to do is come up with a total population of potential vulnerabilities, right?
Right.
So I could combine Nessus with CVE with NIST database of vulnerabilities, on and on and on, to create this big population of potential vulnerabilities.
And then how do you quantify that from a risk perspective?
Well, I think the question is, like, how do we say, sure, there's a gazillion vulnerabilities. Which ones are actually threats?
Right.
So probably what we want to do is then join that up and analyze those vulnerabilities against our population, our universe of IT assets, or perhaps pull all of our ServiceNow Jira tickets, and compare to that to see which ones are already being actioned, all of that sort of thing.
So you've done that all for the client here?
Magically, in this case, we'll assume that we've done all of that, and I wrote it into this magical script called Identify Threats that goes through all these different vulnerability sources, appends them all together, compares and analyzes which ones do we perceive as actual threats. In this case, so I get the results of that out here, and I've also, in this case, published them to, as you might expect, to ACL GRC. So you can see in our results tool in ACL GRC, I have a threat and vulnerability management collection, but specifically a repository I'm keeping now of threats that have come out of all of my Nessus scans. And so then I can use that, of course, to summarize the overall threats in a number of different ways. So in this case, there's all of the different vulnerability names that we've identified as threats, what their rating is, high, medium, low, none across here, and I can start to see highlights of where there's substantial amounts of vulnerability, right? And of course, there might be all manner of ways in which I want to summarize that threat data. Question becomes now, okay, we went from millions of vulnerabilities down to perhaps a few hundred relevant threats. How do I translate to risk? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly my question.
And so I would argue in this case, in this simple example, what worked for this client? There could be other ways to do this. We did an episode previously on scenario modeling. If you were really advanced, you could go do predictions and simulation analysis of all these different threats materializing and what would the impact on the business be, and you could come up with a very highly scientifically quantified business impact if you're advanced in your ability to build analytical models and that sort of thing. That's probably more than most organizations could do, and so I would argue that perhaps some simple key risk indicators might be an easier way to provide the same sort of insight. All right?
So by key risk indicators, you mean just like the quantity or the number of assets that have...
Exactly. So in this case, I've basically created a metric that shows just in aggregate the number of outstanding threats that haven't yet been actioned or issued, that haven't yet been actioned. And of course, in my actual, now when I think back to my actual risk control frameworks and processes and how we manage controls within the IT department. So I have this monthly vulnerability scan control, and I've associated with that the outcome of our data analysis down here of all of the different open threats, and associated specifically that particular metric of valid open threats as my ongoing monitor of this particular control. And then what I've done is, based on a decision about risk appetite or whatever you want to call it, how many valid threats can be open at any given time before we make the decision to change our assessment of this case, change the assessment of a control from working to not working. This might even be more valid, attaching that same sort of metric to a risk, right? And saying, hey, once there's over 20 open threats, we're going to change the likelihood of the risk materializing from low to medium. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I'm not sure if this is the right KRI that you want to... I mean, even just one of these threats that get breached, or wouldn't that create a risk by itself? I mean, the quantity, I'm not sure is the...
That's what these guys were looking for. So it's a matter of, I think that's the question, right? Is what's the right KRI for you and the way you structure your risk questions. Mm-hmm. So to your point, perhaps the right metric would be a open threat score that scores up based on the severity of the particular vulnerabilities that are left open and haven't yet been actioned. So that we're thinking about, based on how they're being actioned and the severity of vulnerabilities that have been decided to be actual threats, that we can translate that into how we score up or score down the risk using this idea of a key risk indicator.
Right. To me, it's the amount of time that a threat is being identified that hasn't been closed, and the aggregate of that across the severity of that threat, that would indicate my risk.
Which could also be easily compiled into a KRI, right? And associated to a risk or a control in this way to drive in real time the assessment of that risk, right? And that would then in turn change things like a scorecard that showed, across all of our different IT process areas, one of those process areas being network security or physical security, as those KRIs move based on new incoming vulnerability and threat data, and as we change risk scores or control evaluations based on it, our scorecard will update and say how good are we looking in physical security, network security.
Did you demo this to the client?
Application security, etc.
Did you demo this to the client?
Yeah.
What did they think?
We got great feedback on the notion of we're in control now and able to write our rules around how do we actually quantify the change in a risk being rated medium to a risk being rated high, right? It allows you to use KRIs to build in that sort of statement on risk tolerance, as it were.
Great.
That's the session for today. Anything else you'd like to add to our discussion of threat and vulnerability management?
No, seems like the right thing to do.
You were almost useless in today's conversation, Phil, but I appreciate the thoughtful questions and the really sharp red glasses.
See you next time.
Phil, look forward to seeing you next time.
Cheers.
Cheers.